Hello to everyone who's joining us this afternoon for this exciting webinar. I'm Maggie Dimmick. I'm the Associate Curator with the Olana Partnership, and it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce this afternoon's speaker who will be talking about a topic that, of course, is very, very dear to us at Olana. Marianne North, an extraordinary artist, painter, biologist, and all-around interesting person. And those who are familiar with Olana, as I think many who are watching today are, will know that we're lucky enough to have examples of North's artwork within the Olana collection. In fact, in the studio at Olana, you can today view one of her incredible botanical paintings, which I'm sure our speaker today will be speaking about a little bit more in depth. But it really is my pleasure to be able to introduce this afternoon Dr. Lynne Howarth-Gladston, who will be speaking further about this topic. So Dr. Howarth-Gladston is a writer, a curator, designer, artist, an independent academic. She's authored many publications on the subjects of Chinese contemporary art and curatorial practice. She's written extensively on the topic of Marianne North, publishing several articles previously, but her most recent book and the subject of today's talk is Marianne North, a Victorian painter for the 21st century. It's published by Lund Humphreys and Q Publishers, and it was out just recently in 2024. Howarth-Gladston trained as a botanical illustrator at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. She's a practicing artist who has exhibited her work in the UK, in China, and Australia. She earned a doctorate in critical theory at the School of Philosophy, Nottingham University. So we're so excited to have her. And I'll just say, please welcome me in joining Dr. Howarth-Gladston.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you, Carolyn and Maggie, for your kind introduction. Carolyn, if we could have the first slide, please. The talk today is the North Gallery and its curated interior. Next slide, please. Marianne North was an amateur Victorian painter whose family were part of the British upper class. In 1871, after the death of her father and a substantial inheritance, North embarked upon intrepid painting journeys abroad in order to try and paint the flora and fauna of the world. In a letter to Dr. Arthur Coke Burnell, North wrote, "Have you heard my Kew scheme? I'm going to build a gallery for all my botanical and plant subjects, with a house attached and a studio for myself or other artists who wish to paint specimens there." Next slide, please. The 1,000 to 2,000 British pounds provided by North for the building of the gallery, approximately 300,000 British pounds today, was modest for such an ambitious project. The North Gallery is, from the outside, an unremarkable, largely brick-built structure, similar in its general appearance to a Victorian domestic villa, situated in an unassuming position at the east-facing boundary of Kew Gardens. A site for the gallery was eventually found next to an unused railway lodge designed by W. Eden Nesfield at the edge of Kew. North had previously rejected a prominent site behind the Temperance House at Kew because it would have involved the felling of some noble trees. The Scottish amateur architect James Fergusson accepted North's request that he design and build her gallery. He responded by making use of inexpensive, readily available materials such as brick, ceramic tile, and cast iron, all of which was mass-produced in industrial Victorian Britain and circulated at home and throughout the British Empire. With plans for the gallery build secured, North embarked upon her second visit to the US in 1881, leaving funds for Fergusson to build the gallery and employing a friend, Miss Hewitt, as a proxy supervisor. The then head of Kew Conservation, Jonathan Farley, and I would often talk about the North Gallery and how upon entering the gallery, visitors might first ascend a flight of stone steps to a veranda supported by decorated cast iron columns. There are 2 iron benches on which to sit and look upon the Botanic Gardens before entering the gallery. Next slide, please. Upon entering the gallery through the front door, there is a vestibule containing a bust of North made posthumously, now thought to be of her niece, Catherine Furse. Next slide, please. The North Gallery opened in 1882 and currently houses 832 of North's botanical and topographical paintings, 16 large decorative panels, several decorative door panels and surrounds, and a dado running around the lower walls of its main exhibition spaces, composed of 246 abutting strips of wood from around the world. Since an extension to the gallery in 1886, its display of North's botanical and topographical paintings has remained largely unaltered. Once inside the gallery, one is confronted by a set of double doors that lead into the gallery's main exhibition space. One then finds two rooms containing North's paintings and a first floor balcony with iron balustrades, a studio room, now a display room, and benches on which to sit, and recently placed vitrines containing North-related items. Next slide, please. The North Gallery is to some extent a kit build, as its appearance corresponds to semi-prefabricated British colonialist architecture between 1840 and 1880. Kit houses were reproducible brick structures based on model houses designed by Henry Roberts for the Great Exhibition under the direct patronage of Prince Albert. These portable brick houses became available in Britain and across its empire from the late 1850s onwards, and were based upon the model housing and the model cottages which Roberts built at the Great Exhibition. Fergusson did not care for the mid-Victorian love of ornament, according to C. Cunningham in James Fergusson's History of Indian Architecture. He suggests that Fergusson was quite Ruskinite, John Ruskin being the architect and art critic and painter, in his thinking regarding design outcomes. Fergusson's preference for Greek and Roman design appears to have guided him towards a combination of Western classical and simpler non-classical architectural styles upon the build. This is arguably reflected in the design of the North Gallery exterior, which is largely without ornament. The gallery also displays the prevailing high cultural taste for simplicity, fashionable during the 1870s. Before leaving for another adventure abroad, North had suggested to Fergusson that the gallery be Indian in its outline, with faint echoes of the bungalow-type dwellings that Europeans built in India. Fergusson was familiar with colonialist architecture in India. Fergusson's use of cheap, easily sourced, mass-produced materials enabled a quick build too. Today, the North Gallery's construction is often perceived as antiquated to modern eyes. It is, however, thoroughly contemporary in the context of the late 19th century Britain. Next slide, please. North's inclusion of a dado was a fashionable as well as practical aspect to late Victorian homes. North devised the technique to display her array of exotic woods collection. The woods were collected on her travels and have a direct relationship to not only the geographical zone represented, but also the plants, trees, etc. that she produced paintings for in the zones. A possible source of inspiration for the North Gallery's dado may have come from North's travels to the United States. North writes of having seen different sorts of wood, including black walnut, butternut, hickory, ash and pine used for floors, staircases and chimney pieces inside Mr. and Mrs. Adams' house at Quincy in 1871. Mr. Adams was the son and grandson of former US presidents. North describes the various woods as being beautifully put together with very little ornament, sometimes a line or simple geometric pattern cut and filled with blue or red and the rich natural colour of the wood kept as a groundwork. Next slide, please. Practically, excuse me, the lack of damp-proof courses in Victorian houses meant that plaster tended to fall off the downstairs walls as the damp rose to a height of about a yard. So Victorian cottage walls were often lined with tong and grooved pine or deal up to that height or higher. Next slide, please. The Victorian industrial grime tended to reduce colours to a dull, monotonous grey. North's sister complained of such calamities, stating that collections of stuffed birds and tropical butterflies were both sadly liable to ruin from the London climate and dirt within North's home. Next slide, please. The North Gallery's painted walls with muted palette scheme fits with the installation of gas and electric lighting. By insisting on a dense hanging scheme for her paintings, the North Gallery's pictorial hanging scheme was also in keeping with picture and photography hangings in the Victorian home. The top-down natural lighting of the gallery through clerestory windows on the upper floor applies classical architectural principles set out in Fergusson's treatise, An Inquiry into the True Principles of Beauty in Art of 1849, which includes an account of the interior lighting of ancient classical temples such as the Parthenon. Fergusson also included an underfloor heating system, modelled after the use of hypocausts during Roman antiquity. However, this damaged the pictures over time, as the heating system created an unstable atmosphere, according to the Kew Conservation Team in 2006. Next slide, please. The visual cluttering within rooms was characteristic of French interior decor and perceived as having been an import into the UK. It appears that this form of styling was not approved by many British leading designers of the day, including Ruskin. Next slide, please. The new interior colour schemes ushered in by improved lighting included russets, apricots, slate blues, teals and dark browns, as well as greens. The new colour palettes also accorded with North's use of teal and plum on the exterior of the gallery and dark brown and green in the studio room, with a dusky pink being applied in the interior of the North Gallery. High key colour paint and wallpapers were applied to early Victorian walls when candlelight was the only available interior light source. This generally dimmed the ferocious coloration schemes. Muted colours became fashionable in the last quarter of the 19th century. This was due to the introduction of first gas and then electric lighting, illuminating rooms better. Inside the North Gallery, the colours painted upon the gallery walls are a muted palette scheme, and the gallery was initially installed with gas lighting, later converted to electricity. In the 1862 International Exhibition UK, John Gregory Crace devised an interior scheme that was a wealth of pattern and colour, which included stenciled decoration and with painted cornice and column decorations too. This was perceived to have wedded archaeology with art after the rediscovery of ancient colour. North and Fergusson have included numerous references to ancient design in the building of the North Gallery exterior and interior. Next slide, please. Doors within wealthier Victorian homes were generally panelled. The internal doors reflected the style of the rest of the house decor. Alongside the use of framed architraves, classical columns, carving and decorative panels also included all types of glass and painted panels using stencils, particularly painted scenes and patterned wallpaper. Next slide, please. The doors in the North Gallery have been painted onto canvas and then maraflaged, fixed with adhesive upon the panels. Extending the number of paintings, North produced a flora within the space. The doors also include gold gilding. Next slide, please. John Ruskin, writing in his book The Stones of Venice, declared, under rule number 2, never demand an exact finish for its own sake, but only for some practical or noble end. A declaration that Matthew Sweet, in his book Reinventing the Victorians, interprets as, don't go mad with stencils and varnish and stippling when something simple will do. Next slide, please. The use of gilded decorative panels is also redolent of Japanese-style interiors that were exemplified by Thomas Jekyll's Peacock Room, designed by James McNeill Whistler to display Chinese blue and white porcelain, as well as the Green Dining Room in the V&A, with its gilded decoration by William Morris in a medieval style. Next slide, please. Framed small panoramas can be witnessed in the North Gallery, as well as gilding. The image opposite has applied a William Morris design panel to the wall. Next slide, please. The use of chinoiserie was also fashionable from the 1860s onwards. It was made popular by the Pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. There are no windows in the North Gallery, and the gilding illuminates the rooms. North visited Japan and witnessed how they applied gilding in their temples. North also acquired Japanese Satsuma-ware porcelain, which also contains gilding. Next slide, please. The cornice or frieze were applied to complete the decoration of the wall by joining the wall to the ceiling. Highly decorated cornices, like the ones in the North Gallery, containing elaborate designs, were also available for the home. These included foliage, Greek motifs, and scrollwork, and were often painted in several colours. These were also cheap to install. The central area of a wall within a Victorian home was decorated usually with densely patterned wallpapers. North designed and personally painted the stencils within the North Gallery. Next slide, please. The encaustic tiles, laid in patterns of black and white, browns and creams, were usually laid on the hall floor and path leading to the front door of middle-class Victorian homes. North used Minton encaustic tiles for the interior floor of the gallery. This could have been for practical as well as fashionable purposes. Next slide, please. North wrote to Joseph Hooker of Fergusson's plans being far simpler than she first fancied. North was nevertheless pragmatic towards Fergusson's stewardship of the gallery's design and construction. Instead of requesting wholesale changes, North thought of adding creepers to cover the gallery's plain, almost suburban exterior brickwork. It was also a material that was increasingly used for prefabricated buildings and even became associated in the British mind of the public with cheap utilitarian buildings. The unadorned exterior of the North Gallery also appears to have troubled Fergusson. He wrote to Hooker on the subject, referring to the building as a single ugly shed and declaring, perhaps despairingly, I am not a practicing architect and I have no staff. Next slide, please. North eventually devised the use of a veranda made from ironwork for the building facade. The addition by North of the wrought iron veranda to the gallery facade, often a kit structure, were originally devised, designed, produced, and then sold from Glasgow. These appendages were used on buildings all over the colonial world to dress a simple building and were thus perceived as functional as well as fashionable. Fergusson remedied North's complaints about the simplicity of the gallery design by applying a design system he devised from his Handbook of Architecture, 2nd edition, 1859, that illustrated how a plain structure may be progressively changed into an Italianate facade, and citing examples of how this might be applied. Next slide, please. On her travels, North would have witnessed the fashionable forms of buildings and interior decorated surfaces in Australian homes and municipal buildings during the 1870s and 1880s. The North Gallery interior also displays very Australian colourways upon its walls, as well as stencil designs, with similar styles becoming popular in the UK in the 1890s. It is interesting to note that within the North Gallery, the height of the dado, the wall zone, and the size of the cornice and frieze, usually placed below the cornice in Australian house design, are proportionally very similar to those applied within Australian homes in the 1870s and 1880s. The cast iron decoration boom ceased around the end of the 19th century because of the introduction of new architectural styles. The design of the North Gallery could be deemed in keeping with the fashion. Next slide, please. North personally knew the American painter Frederick Edwin Church. North's first ventures abroad in 1871 was to visit first Canada and then the US. It was then that North stayed with Church, first at his cottage in New York State, when Church began building Olana, and again after its build in 1881. North witnessed the finished Olana build upon her second visit in 1881. North described how they had mounted 700 feet above it, Olana, by a new zigzag road through the forest and came to the clearing on the top, in which was the picturesque eastern-looking house with its Moorish arches and windows and coloured tiles, having a grand view of the winding Hudson beneath and distant Catskill Mountains. Next slide, please. Here we have an image of the painting of a study of a pelican flower now hanging in the Olana interior, attributed to Marianne North. Next slide, please. And again, opposite, we can witness the attributed North painting given to Church and the architectural and interior decorative styles at Olana too, which displays a cacophony of architectural and interior decorative styles, similar to that found in the North Gallery. Next slide, please. The overall design of Olana interiors, including the use of multiple hangings of pictures, the painted doors, cornice and door surround, and painted muted paintwork, are arguably similar to North's gallery interior. Church delighted in decorative details that could animate flat surfaces, with silver and gold paints on interior doors that caught the light. Next slide, please. North wrote, Mr. Church was going to paint some of his passages in arabesques of luminous paint. The passengers had windows to light them by day, but no lamps, and he thought the phosphorus lines would be enough to show the way at night, and that the daylight admitted by the windows would prevent it from fading away. This idea was not, however, applied. Next slide, please. As noted in North's diaries, Olana was decorated with Japanese metalwork, Chinese faience, and Persian carpets, Italian pictures, Mexican pottery, and Shaker chairs. Next slide, please. According to North, Mrs. Church made a perfect centre to the curious Damascus Hall, excuse me, with its high pointed arches, oriental divans, and central fountain. There were also exquisite Persian rugs, bronzes, carvings, porcelain, etc. North concluded that she herself had a Chinese bed, which was a marvel of wood, horn, ivory, and even jade carvings, and its coverlet and pillows were made of the richest Japanese embroidery. Next slide, please. The donating picture hanging and the interior house designs devised by North, and placed into a gallery setting can also be witnessed in Church's dining room. There is also a Claude Lorraine painting amongst Church's collection, a favourite painter of North's. Claude was an important influence upon many other Victorian landscape painters. Next slide, please. Transcendentalism was a belief that arguably distilled ideas held within English and German Romanticism. It espoused personal freedom and self-expression outside of the establishments and institutions of the day that also included organised religion. It also held that every person should be a self-reliant individual and hold a deep reverence for nature and a desire to preserve nature. Ideas not so different from North's own beliefs and painting outcomes. Next slide, please. Olana was the culmination of Church's desire to bring the natural world into view through his art that was influenced by the German scientist Dr. Alexander von Humboldt. In his book, Volume 2, Cosmos, Humboldt discussed landscape painting and recommended the art for its primary experimental utility. Next slide, please. Humboldt's book, Cosmos, a sketch of a physical description of the universe, appeared on London bookshelves in the 1840s. The book included 5 volumes. It covered cosmological phenomena in nature and the universe. Humboldt was also an early naturalist, geographer, travel writer, and botanist, and posited the interconnectedness of nature. Church had strong leanings towards scientific ideas and travel, which led to a scientific interest in nature that Church placed centrally within all of his paintings. The empiricist German scientist Alexander von Humboldt was a great inspiration to Church. Humboldt wanted landscape painting to achieve panoramic proportions. Panoramas were devised to educate the public about the geographical world and regional flora and fauna of the earth. They could move on rollers or be stationary. Church's painting, The Art of Andes, prescribes to Humboldt's ideas on detail to nature, and its size is notable. John K. Howitt, in his book Frederick Edwin Church, states that Church was astonished by the size, power, and emotional depth of Humboldt's concepts. The painting was made into a prominent print and bought by Edward Lear, the painter, who incidentally thought it to be a great painting. Next slide, please. North saw firsthand Church's pictures and his painting style during her Olana visits. The landscapes of lush verdure, as witnessed in the artworks of the American landscape painters of the Hudson River School and the Luminist Group, were arguably an influence upon North's compositions and painterly technique, as witnessed in the painting of Niagara opposite by North. Next slide, please. Olana allowed Church to cross fluidly between the 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional. The interior at the house, especially, offered Church opportunities to explore this dimensional fluidity that arguably allowed for Church to produce panoramic paintings from within his home studio. Humboldt confirmed an inherent connection between art and science, extolling the power of landscape painting to engender knowledge and appreciation of the natural world. Next slide, please. North produced numerous individual panoramic paintings. Many of them are small scale, similar to Luminist paintings, and are set within a gallery, in most cases below the cornices. North's pictorial hanging system could be reviewed as being in keeping with Humboldt's vision. Since North's paintings express Humboldt's ideas on landscape painting through the depiction of geographic topography and the regional vegetation found in these places, but also align with Humboldt's ideas of a global museum that could create a panoramic experience. North had even devised a global map for the ceiling of her gallery, which would arguably have signalled to viewers of the day the Earth's position within the cosmos. Should we then regard the North Gallery as not only a complete artwork, but an Humboldtian museum gallery as well? Next slide, please. The North Gallery interior is like a large-scale cabinet of curiosities. It is also reminiscent of a large-scale panoramic gallery museum space, which Humboldt wrote about being the perfect vehicle for showing audiences the global world's flora and fauna, as well as geographic terrain. Arguably, North was the only person in her lifetime to achieve this task. The structuring of the North Gallery's display of botanical and landscape paintings arguably relates closely to Humboldt's conception of the panorama. Humboldt suggested that besides museums, panoramic buildings containing alternating pictures of landscapes of different geographical latitudes and from different zones of elevation should be erected in our large cities to raise the feeling of admiration for nature and increase the knowledge of the works of creation. North's paintings arguably express Humboldt's ideas on landscape painting through the depiction of geographic topography and the regional vegetation found in these places. The gallery arguably aligns with Humboldt's ideas of a global museum picture gallery to create a panoramic experience, since North's pictorial hanging system could be reviewed as being in keeping with Humboldt's vision. And that ends the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was incredible to see. Thanks for really bringing us. It felt like we were touring the North Gallery ourselves, I have to say.
Thank you.
Um, for those of you who are watching, we'd love to be able to take some questions at this time. As Carolyn said, you can use the Q&A function of the webinar to submit some questions. I'm going to get started. I think, obviously, with a question of my own. I think one of the things that's fascinating about being able to speak to someone like yourself, Lynn, and who's been researching an individual in their work for so long is the sort of the level of detail you're able to get into and what you're able to read. And I noticed that you were citing several times from some of North's diaries. Of
Yes.
course, we know, yeah, so, and some of those, as we understand, had essentially some extracts had been published, I believe, posthumously by her sister. And of course, we know here at Olana that Frederick Church or the Church family owned volumes of those diaries here in the main house at Olana. Had you had any opportunity to encounter any of North's original diaries or letters yourself in the course of the research for this book?
Yes, there's a quantity at Kew. So I've had access to those because my PhD was also based on Marianne North. So I spent many a day in Kew Archive and Library reading actual letters and archive material there.
Yeah, it's always incredible. I mean, when you're able to see someone's hand itself in the archives. I've had several questions that are coming in, so I'm going to move right on. So we've got a question from Amanda, who is asking, she's curious, how was Marianne North's gallery perceived in her time? Did her gender play a role in her perception of subject matter, galleries, or other activities?
Okay. Yeah, well, she was actually very fashionable as a person. She knew virtually everybody. Her family, as I stated in the talk, were very um, well off and very well connected as well. So she had access to a lot of fashionable people at the time. She knew a lot of scientists, but also painters. She knew she was very good friends with Edward Lear and William Holman Hunt. So the Times would actually, Times of London newspaper would declare when she would go off to visits abroad and when she would come back. And then when the gallery was opened, there were often soirees held there and the fashionable would turn up. She did get some criticism from certain aspects of the press at the time because they thought that the gallery was too tightly hung in terms of the paintings, because they were, I expect, expecting it to look more like a general gallery or museum where there would be space around the pictures. But of course, the argument to the book is that this was deliberate. You know, North hung these pictures herself. The exterior of the gallery was basically the domain of Fergusson, but she had total control of the interior. So it's not by happenstance or because somebody else placed these pictures in that way. It was totally devised by North to be curated in that manner. So she was fashionable in her day. She became unfashionable later, largely I think because of aspects to do with the kind of destruction of ideas and aesthetics of Victorian aesthetics by members of, say, the Bloomsbury group in particular, who didn't like Victorian aesthetics of furniture and thinking. And so throughout the 20th century, she did become a little bit unfashionable. But she's always had pilgrims visit the gallery. And numbers and interests apparently are going up in her gallery and work today.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to keep moving on because we've got a lot of great questions. So one, Megan asks whether North, or if you can speak a little bit about whether North ever considered employing a geographical ordering of her paintings within the North Gallery, you know, whether that's continent by continent, or some other type of ordering. Maybe you're able to just sort of speak about her organization of her work within that space.
The gallery is zoned, so all the geographical areas are zoned, and the woods underneath, as I stated in the talk, link to that particular geographical zone. Um, so it was deliberate because she wanted it to be somewhere that could be educational as well. Um, the leading ideas man really was Henry Cole for the Great Exhibition, and he was also involved in municipal libraries and museums, etc. at the time, to be open to the public. He was quite keen on allowing people to use aspects of, you know, like Kew Gardens and parks to be educational centres as well, and to be open to the poor. So North deliberately made a catalogue of all the zones and explaining what the plants were for audiences. And for those who couldn't afford a catalogue, she cut it up and it was placed, I think it was in the vestibule, for everybody who couldn't afford one to read it and know exactly where each plant was and where the zone was, etc., etc. She didn't cover the whole of the world. I think if she'd lived longer, she might have had to have another extension placed upon the gallery. But she had a fair crack at at most parts of the world. So not every place of the world is represented. Japan is there, for example, but China isn't. But yeah, there's a fair amount of geographical information there from around the world.
Hmm. No, it does. Having not visited myself, it does sound like there's clearly a pedagogical sort of teaching aspect to it. To your point about just sort of the extent of her travels, I have a question I'm going to pose to you this is from Carol. And she's wondering if you could speak a little bit more about essentially how North was able to not just find, but also access and witness firsthand some of these extremely rare and unusual plants. Carol, who's asking this question, is saying that when she visited the North Gallery last year, she was struck by how rare or uncommon some of these specimens would have been, and she's imagining they would not have been easy to find. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
At the time that North was going out and producing the work, the world was obviously a very different place. Because of her connections, she was written letters of introduction to certain places. And upon landing there, she would possibly stay with, at an ambassador's house, or she would visit and stay with friends. And then she would go off on her own journeys, hiring guides at certain points in Chile, for example, when she was going up the mountains. She couldn't have done that completely on her own, so she would have had to have hired a guide with mules to get her up there, even though it was quite dangerous. Um, but with the world being different as it was then, it meant that when she was in Brazil, the Botanic Gardens in Brazil at the time were quite open and wild, much wilder than they are today. So she had better access, I think, to what would have then been stranger and more unusual things. Today, because of mass tourism, that's largely changed, and institutions have changed with the times. When North was travelling, it was much more, as you would say, natural and less organised. So she could actually go to places and access rare plants, etc., that were not necessarily, um, easily available. Well, not necessarily easily available to others at the
Mhm.
time because of her connections as well.
Just a bit of a related question. This is from Lisa, who's asking that given the extent of her travel and the fashion in which she was traveling at the time, I mean, are you aware of any, trouble she had, whether specifically illnesses or other challenges she may have faced that she recorded or wrote about?
There were quite a few actually. She she didn't necessarily always stay in great places. Sometimes they were equivalent of what we've now referred to as a shed, and rats would eat her boots, and she would travel quite extensively to areas, as I've just said, that were not open necessarily to others in quite as an easier manner, and so therefore she was constantly, I suppose, um, bedding down and being very, very uncomfortable. When she arrived in Sarawak, she was actually told off by Margaret Brooks because her clothing was so ripped, her knees were showing. So she had to go to the market and buy some cloth to actually make herself a dress so that she wasn't, in unsuitable attire and she could attend dinner. So she wasn't particularly bothered about the way that she looked. Um, and towards the end of her life, she did become very ill, and it was the reason why she had to stop painting and traveling the way that she had. Um, we, I don't really know the um, the reasoning for her death. It's often been questioned whether it was hepatitis B through traveling and drinking poor water, etc., etc. But she became deaf for a while, and she heard voices, um, which did abate before she died. But she was very, very ill before her death, which is why she stayed in the UK. And she bought a house in Gloucestershire, and she developed a garden, which many garden designers and botanists, etc., of the day would visit. They were quite interested in what it was that she was planting, including people like Gertrude Jekyll.
Wow. I want to keep going with other questions. I should say that there are several folks who I think would love to talk a little bit about more about North's experience visiting Olana specifically and with church. But I have one other question I wanted to put to you. This is fascinating to me. This is from Annalise, who's asking, is it true that North wanted to have a coffee and tea service at Key as well, but got turned down, so she instead displayed her paintings of coffee and tea? Can you speak to
She
that?
did, yes.
Yeah.
The mariflaged items on the doors that I showed in the webinar were actually her rebelling because she had wanted to have refreshments, and she'd actually hired a caretaker who lived upstairs in the gallery, by the way, at Kew. And she hoped that when visitors came, and the idea to the gallery was that, as I pointed out in the talk, that after walking around the garden and looking at the plants, that you would walk up the steps and sit on the benches and relax and think about what you'd seen in the garden before entering the North Gallery and seeing all the plants in situ that you'd seen outside of the garden itself. And for you to then relax and take refuge for a while. You know, the weather in the UK has never been great. So the veranda that was placed on the extension, on the exterior, was quite useful as well. But Kew didn't want this to occur because they were concerned that smoking of cigarettes had become fashionable by this stage, and they were worried that people would be smoking in there and they would leave nub ends of cigarettes, and that they would lean against the paintings, and that it would become very, very dirty because it would just become a source of kind of an entertainment area for some, or a general cafe hut to others. So Miss North was actually approached by Joseph Hooker's wife, who suggested to her that they couldn't hold it as a refreshment area, but she could, in fact, have individuals who she knew as friends have refreshments in the space. And as a rebellion, as I say, she painted coffee and tea on the doors of the gallery.
Hmm. I love that. So before we switch gears a little bit, I do have, there's one more question here about essentially how has the North Gallery survived for so long in its current condition. I wonder, just if you could speak a bit to this phenomenon of the remarkable state of preservation, not only just the physicality of that structure and the artwork inside, but the idea that it has remained intact as it has for so long, and
Yeah.
how that legacy has endured.
I think it's largely because it was ignored for many years. It was interesting. Edward Borden, the famous English illustrator, produced a book on, well, was about to produce a book on Kew that he was commissioned, and he was a huge fan of Kew Gardens. And you can buy a facsimile of it now through Kew Publishing. And in it, he produced a map, and all the follies are mentioned in the gardens and the buildings, but the North Gallery isn't there. And I think for a lot of years, as I've said, the Bloomsbury Group in particular were very successful in damning Victorian aesthetics. And that carried through to the 20th century. So critics like Wilfrid Blunt, who I've mentioned in my book, and I've written about this in the book, really was incredulous about the building, but also other buildings at Kew as well. Um, it did have one or two facelifts over the years that weren't particularly good. There was one in the 1930s where the tiled floors were replaced by this substance called ribolium, which is the equivalent of a linoleum. Um, and there had been talk by Arthur Hill, who was the then head of Kew Gardens, to place leather sofas inside instead of the benches. Um, that didn't happen, thankfully. The outside was painted a different colour, as were the balustrades inside in the 1980s with a sort of fake verdigris green, which wasn't suitable for the design at all. And then in 2006, Jonathan Farley, who was head of the conservation team at Kew, they basically got lottery money, UK lottery money, to completely conserve the gallery, but also bring it back to its natural design. So bringing back the floors and stripping away the pictures and cleaning them of mold, etc. He told me that one of the reasons why the paintings have kept so well in terms of their colour is because she bought very cheap lead glass, which was available at the time, largely thanks to Paxton, who produced and designed the Great Exhibition Crystal Palace, because glass had become very cheap at that point, which has enabled Paxton to build the Great Exhibition Crystal Palace. So it enabled North to get hold of very cheap greenhouse glass, which is what she used to protect the paintings.
Mm. That's fascinating. I love that kind of peek behind the sometimes these sort of serendipitous, pre-conservation, the as a discipline, reasons for preservation. So I have a question here. This is from Dorothy, and so Dorothy asks, and I'll ask you to speak about this, about whether Frederick Church ever visited the North Gallery.
Okay, no, he didn't, but his daughter Dowie did. She made a special visit when she was over there, and it's been noted as well that she made that journey. But he did when she came over to America in 1881. She was showing her works that she'd produced of Australia, and Church went to find North, which is why she ended up going to Olana for the second visit. So he did endeavour to he knew that she was in town, so he went over there to invite her again to Olana.
Yeah, well, and that sort of segues a little bit into another question. This is from Sean, of course, with the Olana Partnership, our president. And I love, I mean, I think what's so interesting, and you spoke about this, is the fact that North visited Olana twice under very different circumstances. One was before the construction of the main house, which is really kind of the architectural center of the 250 estate of Olana. But which of course was not completed until after her second visit in 1881. So she stayed with the churches both down in what we call Cozy Cottage
That's right,
and
yeah.
up here in the main house. So Sean is asking, and this is interesting. So at Olana, this is a little insidery, we've always been perplexed by the reference in North's account of her visit, a reference to a fountain in the court hall, as there is no evidence of there ever having been one.
Oh,
So
okay.
Sean is saying, is it possible, and so what do you think about this? Is it possible that she could have conflated her firsthand experience with tales that Isabel and Frederick Church shared with her about the spaces they had visited during their travels through the Middle East, which then in turn inspired the court hall? I don't know if that's
Yeah,
something that's you've looked into.
possibly. Not really. Because the only accounts that I have are the written accounts of North. I suppose it might be also interesting to sort of note that the diaries in particular, in which that is cited, were, as you pointed earlier, edited by her sister. So there may have been, some kind of mistake made there, perhaps. But it's interesting because. And in the diaries, North cites that Church and she were talking about how he was going to use luminous paint, and of course that never occurred at Olana either. So perhaps it might have been a conversation that they perhaps wanted to do that and then didn't do, and it was trapped in the diary somehow.
Yeah, it's a good
But
point. I mean, when we have written accounts like diaries on which to base our understanding of people of
mm,
the past, we get all of their misperceptions or misrememberings, or as you say, someone else's mistranslation in some cases.
yeah. I mean, this is
Um,
why it's important, I think, to always remember that it's always an ongoing project. I have been to Olana, and I would be interested in coming again to look into that side of North's travels, etc., so that as an academic, you can iron out these instances. So it's always a progression in terms
Well,
of what you're finding out and what you know.
I can say we'd love to have you here. So you'll
Oh,
just
thank
have to
you.
let us know when your visit
Yes, thank
is
you.
next. So everyone, I am just noting we're about 2 minutes away from 1 o'clock. So for anyone who is planning to join us for just the hour, we're going to be wrapping up soon. I think I'm going to just have one more question to close out
Okay.
the afternoon, Lynn. So this is from Lisa. Lisa says, thank you for the wonderful talk. I am a botanist who studies the life and work of historical women botanists. I was wondering if there's enough detail in North's landscape paintings from Massachusetts and New York State that one could identify locations and make comparisons to the landscape today.
It's an interesting question because Kew had this question themselves a few years back, and their photographer, Andy McRobb, was sent out on assignment to look at particular locations where North had painted to see whether they were exactly the same. And I do write about this in the book about her travels to Sri Lanka when she went to visit the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. And he came up with some quite interesting observations there. It's a little bit lengthy, so I would say if she's interested in that, it is in the book, in the current book. But I will say that generally speaking, North's um, uh, paintings illustrate, or she's tried to illustrate to the observer exactly what plants were available there at the time. And Laura Ponsonby, who was sadly not with us anymore, who was another North specialist and a botanist herself, would say to me that when you look at North's paintings, especially of the trees and of the landscape, she painted them as such so that everybody could see what the tree was and be able to name it and have a correlation to the woods below as well. I guess that's why they were there as well. So another painter that did this, that again is cited in the book, is a painter called Baines, and he did a similar thing where his illustrations were clear enough for botanists to be able to read them visually from the painting themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to be able to kind of read something new like that into the sort of work. Um, so, Lynn, I think what we're going to do is wrap up our webinar. I did, we're sort of, chatting a bit with some colleagues here. And one thing I thought that was interesting, just to sort of circle back, I know that, in discussing Marianne North's diary entries about visiting church at Olana, and of course, as you I think sort of evocatively talked about this notion that he had of using paint that would sort of glow or luminesce or somehow, one thing that we do know is that while he didn't employ something like phosphorus, which it seems like either she was implying he would, there is iridescence within the
Yes,
painted stencils, of course, at Olana. And I think
yes,
those who have visited have probably heard that today the experience of seeing those that kind of metallic paint is dulled because there's
mm,
material that's either patinaed over time. So while we know that we didn't get something quite as sort of maybe innovative as like a glowing paint, there was at least sort of some notion of
yes.
reflectivity. So maybe, I think North was probably capturing some detail there.
Yeah, I
So,
think in the discussion that she had with him at that time when they were talking about that, it must have been quite interesting because she was obviously devising the gallery build at that time. So they were obviously talking about what she was going to be doing within the gallery. I would imagine most certainly, and it's nice to see those close comparisons to the doors in Olana and the doors in the North Gallery and surrounding gilding.
yes. Well, I, for one, certainly hope I have a chance soon to visit the North Gallery
Please do,
myself,
it's
just to
fantastic.
compare. And I'm sure many others here will want to do the same. Um, With that said, I'm going to wrap up our webinar for this afternoon. Thank you, of course, Dr. Howarth-Gladston, for your talk. I know that many will be interested in trying to get a copy of your latest book. And of course, the title is Marianne North, a Victorian Painter for the 21st Century. It's been such a pleasure to have you. And I'll say thank you for everyone who joined us this afternoon. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.